Chapter 24 Attacked by Varudornia. The sun rose, and Varudornia rounded the mountain. Over and around the mountain did Rudornia tread, its wide-toed feet giving it easy grip on the steep rock faces where the other divine beasts would find no purchase. The mountainside shook under it, though not from its weight. The heart of the mountain, fire and stone, whirled and shuddered in its passing, as if its very presence stoked the fires that would wipe the range clean. Every step was an earthquake, every turning of its head was an eruption. To look at it one might think it shaped derived from the lizards that walked freely and comfortably on Death Mountain, though that was not the truth. Its model was ancient, many thousands of years extinct, though the oldest chronicles of Goron history still bore the terrible name Dodongar. Even that comparison failed to capture it for what it was. Only in seeing it from Goron City, how the plumes of ash from the mountainside served to frame it, how the twitching of its tail was visible from all those miles away, could one really appreciate its insistent reality. Its enormous head pointed to Goron City, and the sound it made was like a roar from a beast more terrible than dragons. That mountain was its mountain, and all other peoples, even the Gorons, were only pretenders in comparison. Goron City was a stain on the mountainside. Perhaps that would explain why it had moved on the city before, only to be driven back by its few defenders. Though they were close, though they should have been, the Gorons were not helpless against the power of Rudornia. To attack them from the front invited pain, or even damage, and the power that drove the divine beast could ill afford to do harm to its greatest, most precious tool. More obliquely, then, it would approach, more carefully would it author the doom of the Gorons. Chambers in the side of the divine beast opened, and like wasps pouring from the hive did flying machines issue forth, propellers carrying them high in the air. They bore no weaponry of their own. It was sentries, not guardians, but each of them was connected to Rudornia. What they could see, it could see, and on their targets it would unleash its wrath. 40 sentries rose into the sky. Rudornia's internal factories would need time to make more, so it kept some number in reserve. They were points of light and darkness, flitting through the air. To watch them, one might think them only birds. Kilometers away, Zelda and Pia stepped out of the inn, carrying only the gear they would need during the day. Zelda held the flamebreaker helmet under her right arm, though she was otherwise fully dressed, and her hair hung down in a long, thick braid as she took in the light of morning. Pia, next to her, had foregone the flamebreaker boots in favor of a more potent fireproof elixir, and she had prepared several more in case they should be necessary. They had had some discussion about it, though in the end Zelda acquiesced to the argument that Pia might end up needing every advantage her speed could confer. "Are you ready?" Zelda asked, in a way that said she herself absolutely was not. Pia didn't answer. At first, instead, she looked at Zelda, and then at the mountain, and then at the sky. Still taking in the light and the clouds, she said, "If I had known what we would be facing before the journey began, fighting the divine beast and being attacked by Ganon, I don't think I would have had the courage to come with you. If I had, I would have assumed that I would eventually get used to this sense of impending peril." She held up her hands, and Zelda saw they were shaking. "If it's going to happen, it hasn't yet." Zelda had the urge to put her hand on Pia's arm, to reassure her through touch, and quashed it. "We don't know how we will be approaching Varudornia, but it may not be like Varuda. If your assistance is not necessary for reaching the divine beasts, you are of course free to stay here." Pia went wide-eyed with an expression that shifted from shock to hurt to fear to determination with such rapidity that Zelda thought there might have been a few more changes she wasn't fast enough to catch. "If my presence is ever a burden to you, I will withdraw. Failing that, so long as there is a chance that I may be able to assist, I will stay by you regardless of the danger." There was a promise there, deeper than the words, and Zelda could feel it like a physical object she was holding in her hands. She had known, intellectually and through the intimacy of the goddess's power, that Pia was willing to give her life in the service of their quest. This had frequently disturbed her, but never quite so much as it did in that moment. She had felt herself die the day before. She had experienced, however briefly, the oblivion to which Pia would willingly consign herself. For Hylia, for Zelda, it should have been an enormous, beautiful thing, but now her stomach was twisting into knots and she remembered intimately the pain and sorrow of the champions swearing themselves to her. "I am walking through a world of ghosts," and it was as true as when she had said it in front of Mytha's statue. "I carry them with me. They speak to me. I would not have your voice added to theirs." Pia flushed, not in embarrassment but in a cocktail of emotions that Zelda could not pass. But even without the goddess' awareness she could see the tightening of Pia's jaw, the low heat of anger at an injustice, the need to argue. Then she swallowed all the complexities of what she was feeling, and said, "I understand. I will be safe, as best as I am able." Now Zelda did touch her arm, and Pia's other hand came up, and their fingers brushed together. They were not angry with one another, and each knew that the other knew. That would have to be enough. "I propose that we make our way to Bluto's house." The Gorons started their days early, apparently, as even now children were rolling about with abandon and shops had already opened, the proprietors standing outside to hawk their wares. Rommel wasn't up yet, but other traveling merchants were milling about, taking in the sights of the city and preparing for their long day of business. "Whatever the means by which we address Farudonia, we will need his instruction. With luck, his medicine will have had time to take effect, and—" "Along?" Zelda and Pia both looked up at the sound of the guard's cry coming from the northern end of the city, issued from a diaphragm so mighty his voice must have echoed inside every building. "Along? Farudania's sentries are on the move." "Along?" Beneath the carved faces of Goron heroes, Yunobo winced at the volume of the shove, even as far away as he was. The call of the alarm sent people running. The Gorons reacted first, scrambling and rolling into their homes, their speed a product of careful drilling and real, omnipresent fear of the annihilation bearing down on them. The traveling merchants were next, running as a group back to the inn or taking refuge in the boss's house, which was as good for cover as any other. It was so futurist, that meant everyone should be safe, which meant there would be time to wait for Bluto to get ready. "Han." "Oh no," Yunobo said, as two Hylians ran toward the danger, only just stopped by the guard who had raised the alarm, and didn't they know what alarm meant? The streets were empty. Now all they needed was for Bluto to arrive, ready to keep out the threat. But why wouldn't those two leave? Didn't they know how dangerous this was? Oh, man. Then he realized who he was looking at, saw a braid of golden hair disappear beneath a donned flamebreaker helmet, the crown of silver hair on top of the other head. Zelda and Pia were running toward the danger. Of course they were. They'd done plenty of things like this already. Why wouldn't they run to help now? But they didn't understand. Okay, he could be calm about this. He could. He wasn't in danger, after all. Dark's protection wasn't just for show, even if the only thing he knew how to do with it was stand in one place and take a beating. It was just everyone else who would be in danger if he didn't stand in the right place, or if he couldn't keep going for long enough, or if his channeling failed, or if he didn't start moving soon. That's all. Just the whole city would crumble and everyone in it would die if he was too scared, or too slow, or too foolish, or just unlucky. Yunobo. The same god who had raised the alarm, his voice carrying from clear across the city even as he danced back and forth to keep the two Hylians from getting past his outstretched arms. "We need you now." Yunobo stood on the path that wended over and around the city, snaking beneath the mountainous faces of Goron heroes from the distant past. It was the place he came to be alone, yes, but it also let him see almost everything in the city. A vantage point was, people thought, why he liked to be up there. They'd started to think of him as a protect. Why had he ever let them do that? And its vantage was no good for this situation, because he couldn't actually see Death Mountain's peak from his perch. He inhaled deep, and shouted, "How close is Rudani?" His voice didn't carry quite as well as the guard's, but it did all right. "It's not Rudania. Sentries coming. Maybe 3 dozen. They're nearly to the last line." The gravel in his guts clumped together into what felt like a boulder, and it was all he could do not to be sick. There were 2 kinds of incursions that Farudonia might make when it walked on its own. It would make the ground shake and probably destroy everything with its feet once it arrived. Still, it was relatively easy to drive off. It didn't like taking impacts to the head. But when it sent its sentries instead, when it didn't put itself in range of being attacked, that meant they were bringing fire. Bluto's cannons were set up outside of the city. The reinforcements that kept them from tearing themselves apart meant they could only be rotated just so far, and they'd be useless if the sentries slipped past the zone where their firing lines intersected, which they would in seconds. Which meant the only way to deal with them was to shoot them down with arrows, or else throw rocks at them. He acted without thinking. Boss had told him that if he spent too long thinking he was going to get people killed, so there was no thinking to be done. He rolled, a scrawny, for a Goron, frame tearing along the path until he hit the stone outcropping at the end of it. He launched off it, still spinning, and hit the side of the cliff face under the stone monuments. Stone cropping on his back dug into the sheer wall of rock, giving him enough traction to keep climbing. He had to get up high. That was first. What part of run away because the divine beast is going to kill you do you two not get, brothers? Hey, listen to me. I will pick you up and carry to safety. Go. Hey. Zelda ignored the guard as Pia stepped between them, instead reaching down into herself and grabbing hold of the goddess's power. Not so much that it could be seen, not enough to announce herself as Pia subtly but firmly forced the god away from her, but enough to open the gates of her mind, to expand her senses beyond the confines of her body. The world around her did not fade away, but it became a single part of something much larger. With her thoughts she reached out, seeking for the emissaries of the divine beasts, feeling for the touch of the blight inside of them. If she could find it and snuff it out. There. 40 of them, bits of light and stone and fire and metal whirring through the air on propellers that seemed too small to support their frames. Given the amount of energy they were putting out, the infestation should be trivial to clean. Taking hold of more of the power, she plunged into the heart of one of them, and it was clean. There's no blight, she said out loud, and Pia turned to look at her as the Goron god stared, somewhere between furious and mystified. There's no malice in any of them at all. If there's no malice, Pia said, then why are they dangerous? They are dangerous because if they spot you then Varudani is going to rain death on you. Guru! He's right. There's no malice in them, but there doesn't have to be. They're not independent units at all. They're more like notes for the instructions fed to them by Varudania. They don't even navigate on their own. They relay visual information and use relative positioning between each other and the divine beast as a kind of targeting system, though I don't know how that relates to any weapon system. It's almost topographical. But that doesn't matter right now. I can't clear the malice from here. To stop it we'd have to reach into Varudania itself. The god made good on his promise. He lunged and reached for Pia, meaning to hoist her and then Zelda before running. Pia responded by slipping inside of his reach, planting her hip against his leg, and throwing him like a sack of grain. I'm guessing that isn't an option, Pia said, and the god yelped and swore as he was sent rolling down the hill. Not without drawing on enough of the power to bring Ganon's wrath on us, and maybe not even then. Think. There must be alternative methods for dealing with these things. Not bomb arrows, but maybe if we use shock arrows we could force them into rebooting and... Her senses snapped back to her body. The first of the sentries crested the top of the hill. The sound it made was much louder than she had imagined, and its frame was larger, too. The eye beneath it radiated a deep red light that stood out against the red of the stone, the red of the sky, the red of the fires. It felt artificial, aggressive, instantly dangerous. Like a lantern, almost. It was ahead of the pack, but not by very much. More would follow. Then from above them, high above them, came the sound of a Goron screaming in a combination of determination and raw, genuine terror. Yunobo did not see, really. As he fell, no thinking, no seeing. He was well on his way to just being a rock instead of eating them. He had to empty his thoughts to do things like this. It was a weakness, but he had to live with it. Or try to. He didn't really see it, but he had spaced his jump properly, and he reached out for the sentry he knew would be there. He slammed down onto it from above with his abdomen, instantly breaking the rotor and sending its shattered blades spinning off in 3 different directions. The stone and metal cracked and buckled from the weight of his body and the strength of his grip, and the two of them dropped together like a single unit. It exploded when they hit the ground. The shockwave went through his body. He could feel the ripple as if he were made of water, and the force of the blow blinded him for a moment. His teeth seemed to be stuck together, and the only sound in the world was a very high-pitched whine. Well, one down. Hands on his arms, 2 pairs, trying to lift him to his feet, not quite managing it. I'm okay, he said, hoping he sounded more confident than he was. I'm okay, go. Just gonna get up. Yunobo. Zelda's mouth was pressed almost against the side of his head. She wasn't shouting, but he could clearly hear her voice from inside her helmet, only she sounded like she was echoing twice. What is that? Fighting through the ringing and the haze, Yunobo looked up. Red light. He brought up his arm to shield his eyes from it, and then behind the high-pitched ringing and Zelda's voice he heard a squeal, a siren, and that made his insides turn to liquid. There wouldn't be enough time, now. Bluto still wasn't here, and now everything was starting, and it was about to get very bad. Hit back. Get away. Bora! It was the comfortable lie of the peoples of Hyrule that the divine beast of Death Mountain had no special powers to match its fellows. Vah-Ruta summoned endless amounts of pure water. Vah Naboris could call down lightning from a cloudless sky. Vah Meadow must control the winds, for it could fly despite the Rito insisting that was a physical impossibility. No such power had ever been granted to Vah Rudania, it was thought. Swifter than the other beasts, sure of its footing on less even terrain, that was the real power Rudania was ascribed. What else would it really need? When Death Mountain grew restless, shifting and starting like a giant caught in the throes of nightmare, it was taken as an omen of Ganon. When the heat of the mountain grew so great that flesh exposed to its air would burst into flame, that was seen as an unfortunate shifting of the geological seasons. When Rudania beat its rage into the mountainside and Death Mountain vomited fire and stone into the heavens, it must have been the effects of the physical force applied to it. So did the peoples of Hyrule continue to believe. And while they believed, the shadow that rode the spine of Vah Rudania reached out through the divine beast's power. It read the information fed back by the drones. The appearance of the champion's inherited power, isolated from the weaponry of the sea. Its location, just to the north of the dwellings of those pests on the mountainside. Two more figures, unimportant and doomed as the champion's descendant was. With 39 points of data it could not be sure of its target. With Vah Rudania's power it reached down into the heart of the mountain, and earth and fire alike responded to its call. Death Mountain heaved, and Vah Rudania roared, a sound so enormous that the air around it was pushed back in a visible bubble of light and heat, and then there was fire. Fire and lava spewed into the air, a projectile to rival the wrath of Ganon itself, tracing an arc over the side of the mountain, reaching out to Goron City. Then there was another, and another, and another. And more would follow. It was with arresting gentleness that Yunobo put his hands on Zelda's arms, and she became aware in a distant way that he was even stronger than he looked, and he looked strong. Paya was there, instantly, eyes wide and not quite angry, as Yunobo pushed the princess toward her attendant.
If you're within 10 meters of me in the next few seconds, he said, you're going to die, though.
Without being quite sure what she was going to say, she opened her mouth, and the words she would have summoned left her instantly as Paya grabbed her by the shoulders and did not quite drag her away from Yunobo, further into Goron City.
Paya.
She was sputtering, so surprised she couldn't even manage to be offended.
We can't just leave him there. Not when we don't understand what he's dealing with. We will render him every assistance possible.
And Paya was not trying to be conciliatory. This was surely the tone Impa had used with her, a lifetime ago, when the two of them disagreed and Impa refused to obey her.
When we are sure of what the threat is.
That made perfect sense, and she instantly rejected it. She shrugged Paya's hands off and wheeled on her, and the look of steely determination on the shaky girl's face turned to shock and shame and something like terror at the weight of Zelda's regard. Behind them, the blaring of the sentry sirens was slowly being drowned out by a high whistle.
If you think for even a moment that I will.
They were 15 meters away from Yunobo when he was struck by Rudania's fury. The impact sent a jet of earth and fire into the air, the shock of force making the ground jump like water struck by a stone. Paya and Zelda were flung into the air by the earth rolling beneath them, and though Paya landed on her feet, Zelda landed flat on her back. Yunobo did not move. Dark's protection shone like a beacon, visible through the fire and the smoke, and the earth underneath him was nearly undisturbed as the force of the impact was shunted away and back into the air. So bright was the light of his power that an observer would not have been able to see the young Goron as he held up his fists in the position he had been told Dark used when defending the other champions, as the weight of the divine beast's attack drained him of his strength. The second impact rocked the landscape, as did the third, and the seventh, and the 15th. All over Goron City did the Gorons huddle in their homes, though they were not afraid. Yes, the attack was closer now than it had been before, but Yunobo was there, wasn't he? He was a descendant of Dark. He always ate his gravel. There was nothing to worry about, so long as he did his job. In Bluto's house, the boss of the Gorons rolled out of his bed, the seizing of his back so extreme that he could not stand, but not so extreme that he couldn't claw his way across the floor. He could hear his bones grinding together. Yes, sir. Not just his imagination today, but also, he barely noticed it. Impacts that close meant that the drones had slipped past every line of defense and gotten into the city itself, or as good as, and if they were following that rapidly, then Rudania was trying to wipe them all out. He tried to call out, to reach his medicine, which would take effect too late to be more than useless, to do anything, and found he did not have the strength as his body betrayed him. Outside, Zelda shouted instructions over the roar and Paya was off at a run, nearly flying up the cliff faces that would put her at a vantage point over Yunobo and the sentries. Seeing her rising, Zelda reached deep and grabbed hold of Hylia's strength, and Goron City was filled with a golden light. The impacts did not affect Yunobo physically. Well, not directly. There were definitely some indirect consequences. His suddenly bleeding nose could attest. The most direct effect was the heavy blow he could feel against the very foundation of his thoughts. That made it difficult to be sure of where he was or why he was doing what he was doing. Dark's protection. Always Dark's protection. Never Yunobo's protection. It would never be Yunobo's protection because he couldn't be a hero. Blocked at the worst of the sound and the brightest parts of the light. But the world outside was still chaos. A repeating percussive din as the strength of his will was all that kept him from being pulverized by explosions. It was his will, too. He could feel it bleeding out of him. He had never thought of it as a thing that could be limited, but of course it was. What difference was there between this and when he wanted to stop while trying to eat all his food, or not wanting to continue while going through his training with Bluto, or not being able to take listening to people talk about how great Dark was and how great he must be, how great he had to be to fill those shoes? Why wouldn't those failures everywhere else, where he just wasn't good enough, be any different from failing like this? Dark could stand in molten lava for hours, Bluto's voice recited in his thoughts. Force of will. There was nothing soft or leisurely or lean about him. Another impact, and his teeth rattled in his head as the blow against Dark's protection sent sympathetic shocks throughout his physical body. The sirens were as loud as ever outside, and he thought maybe a guard was still shouting, and there was so much light out there. What was going on? If you don't shape up, kid, every Goron's going to get hurt. Do you get it? You don't get to be a crybaby or a quitter. People's lives depend on you. Everything depends on you. His legs were shaking, and he could barely hold up his arms. For some reason, holding up his arms was the most important thing. He knew that if he lowered them, if he gave in to gravity and the pain in his back and shoulders, then his will would be broken and Dark's protection would disappear and he'd be flattened in an instant. He couldn't let them down. His arms. But the other Gorons, too. Bluto, Zelda and Paya, Ethan. So, was he supposed to just stand here forever? There was no way to deal with the drones without the cannons. He was pretty sure. Maybe if they pushed a rock slide down on top of the whole mess of them, but it would take hours for the Gorons to get there. Could he last 4 hours? It had only been about a minute, and he already felt himself being pushed to his absolute limit, his heart pounding and his chest so hard he thought it was going to burst, his vision swimming from dark to light, and he didn't know which of those was worse than the other, but he knew that either one was a pretty bad sign. He could feel his will running out of him like molten rock out of a pail with a hole in it, knew that it would be empty soon. Was there anything past that? What would be left when his will ran out? What would he even be like in the split second before he died? I wish I wasn't doing all this alone, he thought. That's when he heard the ringing of the bell. The sentries were made to fulfill a specific purpose, and that purpose did not require proper shielding or even any armor to speak of. Each time one was struck by a thunder arrow loosed from Paez made bow, it was forced into rebooting, and crashed and shattered before it could re-engage its rotor. But, by Zelda's count, there were 33 sentries left, and Paya had less than 20 thunder arrows remaining. She was not sure that destroying the sentries would stop the attack on Yunobo, but it was the only conclusion she could reasonably draw. The information that the sentries fed back to Rudania was topographical, so they must have been acting as its eyes. Without their targeting information, would it stop its attack? She didn't know. In fact, she had her doubts, but they had to try. because going directly after Rudonia right now would have taken half a day. With the goddess's strength held in her thoughts, Zelda sent out her awareness, seeking through the mechanisms of the drones. There was no malice in them. As she had seen before, they were working as nodes of the network that Rudonia served as the hub of. She had been dealing with Guardians by purging them of the malice of Ganon's influence, and resetting them back to their base function, but they were fulfilling that function in what they were doing now. The power can do more than banish malice. The thought entered her mind unbidden, though it was in her own voice. She could not have guessed at its origin. She was immediately positive of its veracity. How much? She asked herself, asked of the voice that had spoken out of turn, but no answer came. So, she would make one for her own. Yunobo's pain radiated outward from the impact site. Waves of anguish and exhaustion and loneliness so sharp that it cut through her reverie, jolting her out of her reflection. No force had leaked through his power and touched his body, but he was frightened, and he was dying. She could feel him wavering, unsteady even on the bedrock of his own mind, and knew that if she did not act, then he would not last for very much longer. The drones had a very simple power core. It fed into the surrounding systems through a feed that was not far removed from those of the Guardians, conceptually, but the scale and complexity of it was much reduced. The actuators for the rotors that determined the loft produced in a given moment had an elegant degree of variability, but the logic controlling whether they should be running was wholly binary. The energy flowing through the drones was a river of light, so much like her light, and she had only to reach out. Hayo, positioned high on the cliff, drew another thunder arrow taut. The supply would be exhausted momentarily, and there were too many sentries remaining. Could she bring them down with ice arrows? All at once the rotors stopped, and the sound of the sentries' many sirens took on a strange quality as they plummeted to the earth and shattered like clay pots, their red eyes extinguished. Robbed of the necessary targeting data, the attack from Vah Rudonia halted in that moment, and the last of the projectiles crashed onto the top of Daruk's protection perhaps a minute later. Yunobo did not respond. From inside of the barrier, the guards of the city ran to him, beat their fists against the shield's exterior, called to him, but Zelda could see with her god's eyes that he had fainted on his feet. As if being observed gave him the push he needed, Yunobo collapsed, the barrier following. He was left lying on a small circle of unmarked ground in the center of almost total destruction. Zelda's first thought on a conscious level was to run to Yunobo, to heal him, but her instinct ran deeper, and she threw her awareness at Vah Rudonia instead. So she saw when Vah Rudonia, robbed of its targeting system, planted his feet into the sides of the mountain. She realized, too late, that though she had rid it of its eyes, those eyes had still seen her in their final moments. She saw its head open like the blossoming of a flower, felt the capacitor of its weapon begin to charge, could hear the gathering of energy that would obliterate Goron City as if it had never existed. I can't stop it. Even with all the goddess's power, I don't know if I can stop that blast. And even if I did, Ganon's attack would follow thereafter, and Goron City would be lost in either case. Could Nader stop it? Perhaps insulate critical parts by using ice? No, not fast enough. Nader and Dinral together probably wouldn't be strong enough to force it off target. A beam of light the color of blood, deeper than the burning heart of the mountain, painted the crest of Goron City with the promise of annihilation. No, not Nader, not Dinral, not Hylia. She didn't have the control necessary to stop this through finesse, and she didn't have the positioning to stop it through trickery, and she couldn't use her own brute force without losing in every way that mattered. There was only one other force available to her. The goddess's voice rang out across Hyrule. Metha! The dead princess looked up from her vigil, tearing her eyes from the hero, and looked to the north and to the west. The ghost fires around her were silent and calm. They did not reflect any part of what she must have felt when she saw Vah Rudonia aiming its weapon at Goron City. Rude, she said, barely a whisper, and the divine beast answered with the sound of the trumpeting of the gods, its massive legs shifting under it. The light of its targeting laser swept away from Hyrule Castle, swinging across half the kingdom as Vah Ruda turned. It settled on Vah Rudonia's torso, toward its hips. Metha, whose connection with her divine beast had always been the finest of the champions, adjusted the output of her weapon, estimating against how much armor Varudanya had remaining, having to feel out the question through intuition because she could not crunch the numbers in her head. She never hesitated. If she had, the world would have been lost.
"I'm sorry, Daruk,"
she said, and gestured with her hand. Varuda fired. The defenders of Goron City shielded their eyes from the blueness of the light as it lanced across the sky. At their construction, the divine beasts had been designed to withstand direct attacks by Ganon. In comparison to that, withstanding their own weapons seemed small. Millennia removed, though, suffering from the damage of 2 battles with the calamity and the weight of age and soil, things were different. Varus's attack encompassed the back half of Varudania's body, as well as the swat of Death Mountain's side and a great deal of open air. The light was not turned up to its full intensity, and so the ground was not obliterated, but the earth beneath Varudania boiled like water, and its legs slipped out from under it. Varudania squalled, the sound of a wounded Dodongo, its footing lost in the moment it fired, and a killing light, so much brighter than the one it had been struck with, lanced harmlessly into the heavens. Both pillars of blue dwindled to nothing simultaneously. Liquid stone ran from Varudania's legs as it pulled itself free of the molten muck, the armor plating on the back of its body flaking and cracked, pushed to the absolute limits of its endurance. Tentatively, like a wounded child, it tested its footing on the side of the mountain that had been gouged nearly clean by its fellow divine beast. It roared again, in defiance and in promise, and the sound was as terrible as it had been before. Then, quickly, it began to ascend the mountain, seeking the mouth of the volcano and the cover there provided. How long had Yunobo been dreaming? Well, maybe he hadn't been dreaming, but he'd definitely been sleeping, and usually if he was sleeping then he was dreaming. He could always remember his dreams. Was he dreaming now? He must have been, because if he was just sleeping then the question wouldn't have occurred to him. A light coolness was spreading through him. That was new. He could feel that in his body. Maybe he wasn't sleeping anymore. Then, maybe he was just awake. The coolness felt like he was awake, like it was pulling him out of sleep, up towards the light of real consciousness, but it was protecting him, too. Wasn't it? Insulating him from something. What was it? Oh, he thought. Wow, I would be in a lot of pain if I could feel it. A delirious thought, almost nonsense, but also true. The coolness was between him and his pain, so that he knew it was there but it could not hurt him directly. Which meant he'd gotten hurt somehow. Did he remember? He did. He'd been using Daruk's protection, taking the attack from Varudania, and thinking about how he was going to die. But I'm alive. Yunobo, the boss called, and Yunobo sat up.
"I wish you wouldn't do that,"
Zelda said, putting pressure on his shoulders with her hands, failing to push him.
"I'm not nearly big enough to hold you down."
The light inside of Bluto's house, because that was where they were, and Yunobo was in the center of the floor while the boss was seated on the bed, and Pai stood watch at the door while Zelda tended to him with her healing magic, was soft, not harsh enough or bright enough to hurt his eyes. Which was good, because his eyes were just about the only thing that didn't seem like they should have been hurting.
"Please lie back down,"
Zelda said, and he stared at her, not quite processing the words. She huffed, scowling, when she saw his understanding wasn't keeping pace with her words.
"You still have internal injuries I would like to attend to. Get back on the floor,"
Bluto said, and Yunobo was instantly horizontal again, his head nearly bouncing off the stone.
"D? You just have to know how to talk to him." "That's more than enough of that,"
Zelda said, and something in her tone made Bluto flinch. Yunobo wouldn't know what to make of that for a while.
"Close your eyes and rest. This will take a little longer."
Well, he could certainly do that. He thought, when his lids fell shut, that he would fall asleep again, but he did not. Instead, the passing minutes allowed his mind to catch up with itself, for every part of him to come awake. Maybe it was the healing magic being applied to his head, or to his chest, but the longer he lay there the better he was able to think. To remember. To realize what he didn't remember, had never gotten to see at all. Without opening his eyes, because he did not want to be a bad patient, he said, "What happened?" Zelda answered,
"When Varudania's drones reached the city, you drew their attention. And the divine beasts. You were using Dirk's protection.
And for some reason that name made him wince.
I withstood the impacts of all that fire and stone for several minutes. Paya and I were able to shut down the drones, and Vorudonia was forced into retreat. It wouldn't do anyone any good.
Bluto's voice was gruff and surly from his corner.
Least of all Yunobo. To not tell him all of it.
A pause, as if waiting for Zelda to challenge him. When she did not.
When the drones were brought down, all the gods ran over to try to get through to you. You collapsed maintaining the protection. Good job at that. By the way, that was way more than I thought you could handle. But as soon as the drones were gone, Vorudonia apparently targeted Goron City with a weapon we didn't know it had. I couldn't say exactly why.
His tone suggesting that he had some ideas and that they involved people he was talking to.
But it was suddenly convinced it needed to show its whole hand and wipe us off the map. And I don't know except what the guards tell me, but from what I can gather, these two have already brought the divine beast from Zora's domain under their control. They stopped Vorudonia's weapon with their own, took a plug out of the mountain while they were at it. Then it retreated into the mouth of the volcano. How long ago was that, Guru?
How long have I been out? He wanted to ask.
6 hours.
Zelda lifted her hands away, then breathed a sigh of relief and exertion.
There. You can sit up, now.
She had been tending to him for 6 hours. How much stamina could one person have? He sat up and looked at her face, trying to read her, to understand what she was feeling or expecting, but she just beamed at him. He felt his color rising.
Feeling better?
He nodded, though he still lifted his arms experimentally, poked at his guts where he was pretty sure something had popped before, wiggled his toes.
Yeah. Everything's in working order, Guru. I don't know how I can thank you for helping me over and over. Don't thank them yet.
Yunobo looked over at Bluto, who sounded, and looked glum and resentful.
The reason I had them do this here, kid, rather than at your house, was because I wanted to be the one to talk to you when you woke up.
The boss got up from his bed, slowly, hand pressed to his back.
My medicine is starting to kick in, but I'm still going to be laid out for the better part of another day. But that doesn't even matter, now. Vorudonia's been run off for a little while, but we don't know how deep in the mountain it's retreated or for how long. When it comes back, it's probably going to try to kill us again, and it's not going to give us a chance to fight back. Shooting you out of a cannon isn't going to cut it anymore.
Bluto grinned wanly.
Well, I'm not good at speeches, so listen, I'm proud of you. I'm not good at showing it sometimes, but I am. You're not Daruk, but every day you try to be, and you have all the courage someone could ask for.
Yunobo wasn't sure why that made him feel upset, even resentful, but there it was. He just couldn't let Bluto see, and hoped Zelda and Paya would miss it.
These two tell me there's a monster riding Vorudonia that's making it act that way, and to get things back to normal they have to board the divine beast and kill the monster. And they'll need your help.
Navi looked to Paya, who stood impassive at the door and looked away from his eyes. Then to Zelda, who rose to her feet and bowed very low to him.
Please. If you can bring us to the peak, I know we'll be able to handle the rest on our own.
He swallowed. This was fast. This was so fast. How was he supposed to be able to do something like that? Like this, without being able to prepare himself? Were they going right now? Of course, they were.
I don't know if I can. You don't have a choice, kid.
Slowly, painfully slowly, Bluto made his way across the room, walking not toward Yunobo but toward a chest he kept near his work desk.
It's not fair, but none of this is fair. None of it's ever been fair. I guess I've been trying to prepare you for that. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job.
The sound of his fingertips scraping against the stone of the chest as he ran them with reverence over the lid was audible throughout the entire room.
But you've got power, Yunobo. And when you have power, real power, you don't get to make choices. Not about helping people. That's what being a Goron means.
He opened the lid, but Yunobo was no longer looking at the boss. He was looking at Zelda, Zelda whose eyes were watering as she held her bow and who could not look directly at him. She's afraid for me, he thought. They all are.
You have a soft heart, kid. That's not a bad thing, not really, but it makes all this harder than it should be. I wish you could have an easier life. You can, but I wish you could.
Slow footsteps, nearly dragging across the room.
You can't make a soft heart into a hard one, Yunobo. The stone knows we've tried. So, take your soft heart and help these two up the mountain. I can't help you anymore. but I can make sure you're armed.
Without being prompted, Yunovo reached out. Pluto put the boulder breaker into his hands.